There's a particular kind of pressure that arrives before anyone has seen you play a single professional minute, and it doesn't feel like excitement. It feels like debt. Angel Reese walked into the WNBA in 2024 carrying something most rookies don't have to manage: a fully formed public identity. The national championship at LSU, the pointed celebration that became a cultural flashpoint, the social media following that numbered in the millions before she'd ever set foot in a professional practice facility. By the time the Chicago Sky drafted her, the narrative architecture around her life was already load-bearing. People had decided what she meant. Fans had claimed her. Critics had filed their verdicts, and somewhere inside all of that noise, there was still a 22-year-old trying to figure out what kind of professional basketball player she actually was going to be. That gap between the image the world had constructed and the player still being assembled is where this story really begins. What doesn't get said often enough is how disorienting that kind of entrance can be. The WNBA is not a league that rewards unearned confidence. It is a league of players who have spent years refining their craft in relative obscurity, who understand exactly what their bodies can and cannot do at the professional level, who have absorbed thousands of hours of film and repetition to earn whatever minutes they receive. Reese arrived into that environment already visible, already debated, already larger than the game itself in certain corners of the culture. The question Chicago's coaching staff had to answer quietly and quickly was whether the player underneath the persona had the technical foundation to survive what the league's defenses were about to show her. Preseason optimism is easy. What happens when a scouting report gets built around your weaknesses is something else entirely. And in professional basketball, that report always gets built. Angel Reese grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, not a city that produces soft players. It is a city that produces people who understand, from an early age, that nothing is handed over quietly and nothing stays still long enough to take for granted. The athletic culture there is physical, competitive, and unforgiving in the way that only environments with real stakes can be. Reese came up through that world absorbing its lessons without necessarily being able to articulate them yet. What it gave her was an instinct for contested spaces, for going after things other people had already mentally conceded. That instinct would later translate into a rebounding style that felt almost confrontational in its consistency. She didn't wait to see where the ball was going. She decided, before the shot left the shooter's hand, that the ball was going to be hers. That is not a skill coaches install in players during film sessions. That is something absorbed from an environment where hesitation has consequences and positioning is survival. The road from Baltimore to LSU ran through Street Francis Academy, one of the most decorated high school basketball programs on the East Coast, where Reese developed into one of the most recruited players in the country. But recruitment and arrival are two different things. And Baton Rouge, under Kim Mulkey, was an education in a very specific kind of basketball culture, one built around toughness, visibility, and an almost theatrical sense of competitive identity. Mulkey's LSU program didn't just develop players technically. It developed their presence. It taught them how to occupy space, not just physically, but psychologically, how to make opponents feel their arrival before contact was ever made. For Reese, that environment was both a natural fit and a kind of accelerant. The qualities that had always defined her game were now being amplified, refined, and pointed directly at the national stage. What emerged by the time she won the championship in 2023 was a player who had learned to make her intensity legible, to perform her competitiveness in a way the camera could find and the audience could feel. The question professional basketball was eventually going to ask was whether that intensity, so effective in college, had been built on a technical foundation strong enough. Kim Mulkey's program at LSU operates on a philosophy that is worth understanding carefully before passing judgment on the players it produces. It is not a system designed primarily to prepare athletes for professional basketball. It is a system designed to win college basketball games, generate program visibility, and recruit the next wave of talent by demonstrating that LSU makes stars. Those goals are not incompatible with professional development, but they are not the same thing either. In Reese's case, the system leaned heavily into what she already did, physical rebounding, interior presence, high-volume finishing attempts near the basket, without necessarily demanding the kind of technical expansion that would prepare her for what professional defenses were eventually going to take away. College basketball, particularly at the dominant end, allows certain inefficiencies to survive because the talent gap between programs is wide enough to absorb them. A player who shoots a modest percentage from the field but crashes the offensive glass relentlessly can still be a net positive in that environment because the opposition simply cannot match her athleticism or her hunger for the ball. The professional game does not offer that same margin. Every team has athletes. Every coaching staff has a scouting department. The inefficiencies that were survivable in college become exploitable at the next level, and the adjustment window is narrow. What Chicago inherited when they drafted Reese was a player whose skill set had been validated at the highest level of college basketball, but had not yet been stress tested against professional defensive schemes designed specifically to neutralize it. The Sky's coaching staff faced a challenge that is common in professional sports, but rarely discussed honestly. How do you develop a player whose public profile has already outpaced her technical readiness without triggering a crisis of confidence or a media narrative that makes the development process impossible to manage quietly? Reese's shooting mechanics, particularly from mid-range and from the perimeter, needed meaningful work. Her decision-making out of the post, knowing when to attack, when to pass, when to reset, required the kind of patient repetition that only consistent professional experience can provide. None of that work is glamorous. None of it generates highlights or social media engagement. It happens in practice gymnasiums in the early morning before the public arrives. And it requires a player to sit with the discomfort of being less than what they've been told they already are. Whether that environment was ever truly established in Chicago, or whether the weight of expectation made it impossible to create, is a question the organization and the player would both eventually have to answer. To understand Angel Reese as a basketball player, you have to understand what offensive rebounding actually is at its most sophisticated level. And then you have to ask honestly whether what she was doing in Chicago fully met that definition. Rebounding, in the pure sense, is anticipation. It is reading the arc of a shot, calculating the likely deflection angle, and arriving at the correct position before the ball does. The best offensive rebounders in professional basketball history were not simply the most aggressive players near the basket. They were the most accurate predictors of where a missed shot was going to land. That predictive intelligence is what separates a rebounder who creates genuine second-chance opportunities from one who is essentially recovering their own mistakes. The distinction matters enormously when you are evaluating a player's real contribution to a team's offensive efficiency. A rebound that follows a missed shot by the same player is not the same basketball event as a rebound that salvages a teammate's miss and extends a possession that would otherwise have died. Both appear identical in a box score. They are not identical on a basketball court, and no serious coaching staff looks at them the same way. Reese's numbers in Chicago were statistically significant by any surface measure. The single-season rebounding record stands as a genuine achievement in terms of raw volume, but the composition of those rebounds and the shooting efficiency that surrounded them told a more complicated story. A field goal percentage sitting at 39% in her first season meant that a substantial portion of her offensive rebounding activity was, in effect, loop activity, missed attempts recovered and reattempted, rather than clean second-chance opportunities generated from teammates' misses. Her three-point percentage, hovering near 18% across both seasons, meant that opposing defenses faced a straightforward tactical decision every time she touched the ball on the perimeter: ignore her and protect the paint. When a defense can make that calculation without consequence, it compresses the entire offensive ecosystem around that player. Driving lanes close, pick-and-roll actions become predictable. The floor spacing that modern basketball requires to function efficiently simply does not exist. Chicago's offense ran a significant portion of its half-court sets through a player whose presence on the floor was simultaneously productive in isolated statistical terms and restrictive in terms of what it allowed everyone around her to do. That tension between individual output and collective function is the game within the game that the box score was never going to show anyone. The 2025 WNBA season did not break Angel Reese's relationship with the Chicago Sky in a single dramatic moment. It broke it the way most professional relationships fracture gradually, through the accumulation of small decisions that each seemed manageable in isolation but collectively became impossible to reverse. The season opened in Indiana, and before the basketball had time to define anything, a discrimination claim filed by Reese following the first game set a tone that the organization was not prepared for. The league investigated the claim and found no evidence to support it. What that sequence left behind was not simply a resolved dispute. It left behind a template, a way of responding to difficulty that prioritized public escalation over private resolution. In a locker room environment where trust is the actual currency that determines whether a group of individuals becomes a functioning team, that template is corrosive. It tells every other person in that room something about how conflict is going to be handled, and it tells the coaching staff something about what managing this situation is going to cost them in time, energy, and focus that could otherwise go toward winning basketball games. What followed over the course of that season revealed how completely the foundation had eroded. Reese's public comments about Courtney Vanderloot, a decorated veteran who had left a championship-caliber roster to join Chicago, landed with particular weight because of their timing. Vanderloot was recovering from a torn ACL when Reese told reporters, on the record, that the team needed someone younger and more capable of competing for a championship. The basketball argument embedded in those comments might have had some internal logic to it, but the manner of delivery, public, unfiltered, directed at an injured teammate, demonstrated a judgment gap that no coaching staff can teach its way around. Camila Cardoso, the player Chicago had identified as their genuine long-term cornerstone, reportedly walked away from Reese at some point during that same season. When the teammate who shares your front court and your daily professional life decides that physical distance is preferable to continued proximity, the organization has received all the information it needs. The suspension that came in September 2025 for conduct detrimental to the team was not a surprise to anyone inside that building. It was documentation, the formal recording of a conclusion the front office had already reached. There is a version of Angel Reese's professional story that gets almost no attention in any public conversation about her career. And it is the version that lives in the space between games in the training facility before the staff arrives, in the film room after practice is ended, in the private negotiations a player has with their own limitations when nobody is watching and no performance is being evaluated. That space is where professional careers are actually built or quietly abandoned, and it is the space about which the least is known when a player's public narrative has grown as large as Reese's had by the time she reached Chicago. What is knowable is this: the technical deficiencies that showed up in her professional statistics, the shooting percentage, the mid-range efficiency, the three-point range that never developed into a credible threat, are not the kind of deficiencies that persist without explanation in a player who is genuinely putting in the work to address them. They are correctable with time, repetition, and the right kind of coaching intervention. The fact that they remain largely static across 2 professional seasons is itself a data point, though what it points toward is not something any outsider can state with certainty. What the unseen hours demand from a professional athlete is a specific kind of honesty that is genuinely difficult to maintain when the external world is telling you that you are already exceptional. Reese arrived in Chicago with validation stacked so high around her that the internal voice required to say, quietly and without audience, that the work is not finished yet, that the game needs to expand, that the shot needs to be rebuilt, that the decision-making needs to slow down before it can speed back up. That voice had to compete against an enormous amount of noise, telling her the opposite. The all-star selections came. The rebounding record came. The cultural visibility never dimmed. And somewhere in the middle of all of that external affirmation, the technical development that her game genuinely required was either happening or it wasn't. Professional basketball is patient with players who show up every day and do the invisible work with seriousness and humility. It is ruthless with players who allow the gap between reputation and reality to widen without addressing it. By the end of her second season in Chicago, that gap had become the defining fact of her professional situation. Professional basketball teams are not collections of individuals who happen to wear the same uniform. They are ecosystems interdependent, sensitive to disruption, capable of extraordinary function when the internal chemistry is right, and rapid deterioration when it isn't. The relationships Angel Reese built and failed to build during her 2 seasons in Chicago tell a more complete story about what went wrong than any statistical breakdown ever could. Courtney Vanderloot's decision to leave the New York Liberty, a franchise that had genuine championship aspirations, and join a rebuilding Chicago team, was an act of professional generosity that carried real, personal cost. Vanderloot brought with her 2 WNBA championships, 5 All-Star selections, and the kind of veteran credibility that young rosters desperately need when they are trying to learn what winning culture actually feels like from the inside. She did not come to Chicago to be evaluated publicly by a younger teammate while recovering from a torn ACL. The fact that Reese chose to deliver that evaluation in a press conference rather than in a private conversation with the coaching staff revealed something important about how she understood the social architecture of a professional locker room and what responsibilities come with being the most visible player on a team that older, quieter, more experienced players are trying to hold together. The relationship with Camila Cardoso carries perhaps the most significant weight of all, because Cardoso is not a peripheral figure in this story. She is the player the Chicago Sky have decided to build their entire future around, a legitimate modern center with the footwork, touch, and two-way potential that professional front offices spend years searching for. The two players shared a front court for 2 seasons. They were, on paper, partners, the kind of pairing a team hopes will develop into something greater than the sum of its parts. A front court chemistry that opponents have to game plan around specifically. Instead, Cardoso reportedly reached a point during the 2025 season where she chose to physically remove herself from Reese's presence. That decision, made by a player who is not given to public drama and whose professional reputation is built on focus and reliability, communicated something that no press release or front office statement could have said more clearly. When the person who knows you best in a professional environment, who has shared practice repetitions and film sessions, and the particular exhaustion of a long WNBA season alongside you, decides that distance is the only remaining option, the relationship has moved beyond repair into territory that an organization simply cannot manage its way around. The 2025 Chicago Sky season deserves to be examined as a complete object rather than a series of isolated incidents, because it is only when you hold the whole thing at once that the full picture becomes legible. Chicago finished with 10 wins and 34 losses, one of the worst records in the league, and did so with a roster that included a 2-time All-Star, a legitimate building block center in Cardoso, and a supporting cast that was thin but not without professional competence. The margin between a 10-win season and a 16-win season in the WNBA is not as large as it sounds. It is the margin between a team that is genuinely developing and a team that is spinning in place, burning through games and morale simultaneously. What the 2025 season revealed, decoded carefully, was that Chicago's offensive infrastructure had been organized around a player whose presence created as many problems as it solved. Every half-court possession that ran through Reese near the paint was a possession that required the defense to do very little creative thinking, pack the interior, deny the direct feed, and dare the player who shoots 18% from 3 to beat you from distance. That defensive prescription is not complicated, and the league's coaching staffs had 2 full seasons to perfect it. What makes the performance genuinely worth decoding is not the losing, which can have many causes in a rebuilding environment, but the specific texture of how the losing happened. Chicago was not a team that competed closely and lost at the margin. They were not a team whose record misrepresented how hard they played or how intelligently they were coached. They were a team whose offensive system had a structural ceiling built directly into its design, a ceiling created by the spacing limitations that come with centering an offense around a player who cannot credibly threaten from the perimeter. Reese's individual numbers existed within that system as genuine achievements of effort and athleticism. The rebounding volume was real. The physical presence was real. The competitive hunger that drove her to the offensive glass, possession after possession, was real and should not be dismissed. But professional basketball does not reward effort and individual output in isolation. It rewards the conversion of individual output into collective winning. And that conversion never happened consistently enough in Chicago to suggest it was going to happen with more time. The front office watched 2 full seasons of that pattern and drew the only conclusion the evidence. Every serious conversation about Angel Reese eventually arrives at a question that statistics cannot answer, and that public debate tends to flatten into something far simpler than it actually is. What does this player mean to the people watching her? And does that meaning constitute a form of value that the basketball industry has not yet figured out how to measure properly? The answer is more complicated than either her supporters or her critics have been willing to sit with. Reese arrived in the WNBA at a moment when the league was experiencing a visibility expansion unlike anything in its history, and she was not a passive beneficiary of that expansion. She was one of its active engines. Young women who had never watched a professional basketball game watched her. Communities that had felt peripheral to the sport's mainstream conversation saw something in her presentation and her confidence that felt like direct address, like she was playing for them specifically, with a self-possession that refused to apologize for its own existence. That is not a trivial thing. It is not reducible to marketing or social media metrics. It is a genuine form of athletic and cultural leadership that the box score was never designed to record, and that win-loss records cannot fully contain. What the numbers also never captured was the internal experience of being Angel Reese inside that Chicago locker room during 2 increasingly difficult seasons. The weight of carrying a public identity that had been built at least partly on a foundation of defiance in an environment that was quietly crumbling around her. Leadership in professional sports is not simply the absence of conflict or the presence of good statistics. It is the capacity to absorb pressure without redistributing it onto the people around you, to identify the difference between the battles worth fighting publicly and the ones that need to be resolved in private, and to understand that the most important audience for your behavior is not the one watching on television, but the 12 people sharing a locker room with you every day. Those are learnable qualities. They are not always learned on the timeline a franchise needs them to be, and they are almost never learned when the external noise surrounding a player is loud enough to make self-reflection genuinely difficult to access. What Atlanta is betting on, underneath all the roster construction logic and the front court spacing concerns, is that a change of environment provides Reese with something Chicago ultimately could not: the space to separate who she has been told she is from. Atlanta represents something specific in Angel Reese's professional story, not a rescue and not a reinvention, but an opportunity that arrives with its own set of unresolved questions attached. The Dream are a franchise with genuine talent in Alicia Gray and Ryan Howard, two guards whose best basketball depends on the kind of floor spacing and open cutting lanes that a front court renovation now threatens to complicate. The basketball challenge is real, and the front office knows it. But underneath the roster, construction concerns, and the spacing mathematics lies a more human question that no trade announcement addresses directly. Whether Reese arrives in Atlanta having done the internal work that Chicago's environment either couldn't support or couldn't wait for. Change of scenery trades have a complicated history in professional sports, precisely because the scenery is rarely the actual problem. The habits, the responses to pressure, the instincts that activate when something uncomfortable happens, those travel with the person. What Atlanta is offering is not a solution. It is a context. What Reese does inside that context is entirely her own to determine. What the numbers also never captured was the internal experience of being Angel Reese inside that Chicago locker room during two increasingly difficult seasons. The weight of carrying a public identity that had been built at least partly on a foundation of defiance in an environment that was quietly crumbling around her. Leadership in professional sports is not simply the absence of conflict or the presence of good statistics. It is the capacity to absorb pressure without redistributing it onto the people around you, to identify the difference between the battles worth fighting publicly and the ones that need to be resolved in private, and to understand that the most important audience for your behavior is not the one watching on television, but the 12 people sharing a locker room with you every day. Those are learnable qualities. They are not always learned on the timeline a franchise needs them to be, and they are almost never learned when the external noise surrounding a player is loud enough to make self-reflection genuinely difficult to access. What Atlanta is betting on, underneath all the roster construction logic and the front court spacing concerns, is that a change of environment provides Reese with something Chicago ultimately could not: the space to separate who she has been told she is from who she is still becoming.